Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. Thank you for the invitation. Can you hear me in the back? Okay. I grew up on a farm in Zimbabwe, and I look at research. I've been a researcher my whole life. I want to produce results that can be used by people to improve the management of the land. And a lot of what we've done in the past in agriculture and that we continue to do causes very detrimental effects on the ecology. So I don't like the concept of sustainability. We don't want to sustain something that's degraded. We want to actually regenerate function so that ecosystem services across the board are improved. And I'm going to be dealing a little bit mostly with grazing ecosystem, which is where I do my work. But I recently got dragged into a larger cropping that includes grazing to build up fertility. So I'm going to mention some of that that we're doing with partners. In natural ecosystems, 90% of soil function is mediated by what happens with the soil biota. The soil biota depend upon functioning plants that feed them energy, capture the sunlight, feed it down and feed them, and then they get something in return from the microbes that makes them function better. So it's a system in there. And if we manage the plants above ground very well, then all these things work well. If we don't, if we manage them badly, then probably the first thing it goes is as soon as the structure of the soil and the ability to get water in the ground is dependent upon microbes. If you ruin the structure of your soil, you can't put a chemical on it to improve it. You've got to improve the biological function for that to happen. And in the dry environments of rangeland, the most limiting factor is not the amount of rain you get, but the amount that enters the soil and then is functional to drive the system. Along with that is the energy that you require to drive it. So in order to function well, you have to look after the 4 ecosystem processes. First of all, energy flow, the capture of energy, which drives the whole system. Water cycling, making sure the water gets in the soil and doesn't run off and take the soil with it, gets in the soil so the plants can grow. Mineral cycling is the other important thing, and you need the right species to give you the productivity and to provide all the functions of feeding the microbes. And we're going to be dealing one by one with each of those things and see what we currently do that breaks some of the rules there and what we can do to actually make those 4 things operate really well. Let's look at a continuously grazed landscape, and this is in the hill country down in mid-Texas, 3,000 acre area, stocked overall for light stocking. Those green dots are GPS points through the year. You can see that they utilize the whole landscape nice and evenly, don't they? No, they never do. What happens in those areas they camp on? They overgraze them and set them backwards. What happens in the areas that are outside of that? You're going to say, well, we don't impact them too negatively. Well, we do, but not as negative a way. So the research that's often done is done at that scale, or even smaller. The size of this room would be, some people do research like this and try and extrapolate it to the managed situation. Where would you place those plots, even if you had 3 or 4 of them, in that landscape to actually represent what is happening in that landscape? You can't, because the way animals impact the landscape, the heterogeneity of that impact increases as the scale. So if you're operating at the scale of a commercial ranch, this is what you see. Overuse in some places, underuse in others. Okay, what does that mean? First of all, I've been involved in this process since I graduated in '72. And right around the world, I've made it my business to visit people. This has got an automatic lock on it. And find out what, from the best conservation operators, what they practice, and the ones who are really leading use multi-paddock grazing as much as possible. And overgrazing has very little to do with the number of animals, everything to do with the length of time animals spend in one spot and graze. Now, if you look at continuous grazing, there's a profile with a lot of bare ground and the better species eaten off. And after good adaptive management, you can bring all those areas back again so you get good plant cover and you restore the productivity. You can change that to that so that water runoff and loss of CO2 gets replaced with water run into the soil and capture of CO2. So that's what our research is all about. Now, adaptive multi-paddock grazing, this differs from rotational grazing. Rotational grazing is it's very simple, few paddocks, and people just move the animals in a manner that they think fit. Adaptive multi-paddock is using multi-paddocks and rotating through them and adapting it according to the way the weather changes. The weather can change. It can be double the productivity one year compared to the other. So this is a normal sort of situation. You find a lot of areas where they would have one herd in each one of those paddocks and stock lightly at best. So what the multi-paddock guys do is they divide those up and then they rotate the animals through those areas, making sure there's adequate water point in there. The most advanced people, the ones who are getting the best return for the work they get, the most improvement in the resource, as well as animal performance, they would have one herd and rotating through all of those, having a very short period of grazing and a long period of recovery. And the long period of recovery allows the ecosystem to get back to functioning really well. And it emulates the large herds that moved in natural ecosystems before man started messing around with agriculture. So here's an example from, this is tallgrass prairie, and you'll see a couple of examples, a couple of decent grasses in there. This should be tall grasses, big blue stem, little blue stem, switchgrass, but you see a lot of weeds and stuff in there. What they did is they just put in a simple 18 paddock system with single wire fence, making sure there was an adequate water in there, and then they managed it to improve the species composition. They managed the plants they want to use them moderately, get off until they'd recovered. That's all they did. Very low cost. And there you see animal days, animal unit days, and the years of the thing, and you can see the amount of improvement they got. Nearly fourfold. There's a couple of dips in here. What do you think those are due to? A couple of droughts. Yeah, so if you make the right adjustments in that, you can carry on improving. If you don't make the adjustment, you probably would have plateaued off at about here. So that's where the adaptive management comes in. Now, I've got large ranches now that are operating with 12, 15,000 cattle that are using these principles and have improved the situation exactly the same way as they did on the experimental farm. So they used flexible stocking to match forage availability every year. You need to make sure when you've had a deficit in rainfall, you measure the amount of grass, make sure you get the right amount of cattle. If there are too many cattle, you ship them. The earlier you ship them, the less you affect your cash flow negatively. So it's a good business decision as well as looking after your resources. You rotate through the paddocks to spread the grazing over the whole ranch at the same time, ensuring moderate use in the growing season. You use short growing periods, so you minimize the impact on the plants, and that results in high animal performance because they have from one day to the next, they don't have a declining nutrition that they encounter, and allow adequate recovery. And this is one of the things that's been underestimated in management. Allowing adequate recovery is really important for moving the whole ecosystem forward. And then, of course, adaptively changing in conditions. We had a drought a couple of years back, 11 through 13, where the summer rainfall, which provides 80% of our productivity, failed entirely 3 years in a row. And the guys who managed to practice on these principles, they were not only in business, but their ranches were in pretty good shape at the end of it. The people who didn't do that were out of business. So the research that we've conducted, I started off this, was taking 3 areas in the same ecoregion. Then in each one of those, we had 3 managements. Heavy continuous grazing, which was the norm that everybody is practicing. Light continuous grazing, the best case scenario continuous grazing, and then amp grazing, which changes numbers and moves them and grazes for short periods in each one of those. So we treated those as reps. And what we're looking for is the same difference among the treatments in each county the same? That's what we were looking for. So what we found was that And very importantly, those areas had been managed in that way for 10 years prior to us measuring. So there was a time when each ecosystem had time to settle down to the kind of management that was being practiced. And after 10 years, we found that there were 3 tons of carbon per hectare sequestered more on the Amp grazing than on the heavy continuous grazing, which is stocked at the same level that we found on the neighbors. We decreased the bare ground hugely using AMP, which means more water in the ground. We improved the physical structure, improved the infiltration, bolstered soil fertility, enriched microbial composition. It's very important to have a good fungal to bacterial ratio, and the AMP resulted in a doubling of the ratio between the fungus and the bacteria, which is we'll dwell with later. We improved the soil water holding capacity enormously and enhanced the plant productivity. Just a change in management, and we improved the plant species composition, and productivity increased at the same time because the ranchers managed the AMP in a way that provided them good recovery of resources as well as animal production. So let's look at causal mechanisms. There's an example on the left in our next door neighbors under continuous grazing, moderate stocking. Although they had all the right species in there, the amount of bare ground is much higher than here. You can't see it here, but there was almost no bare ground underneath here because of the canopy, and the amount of growth that took place was considerably higher, a different ballgame altogether. So there we've got Amp grazing on the left. What would you say about the energy being captured in that on the left? Really, really good, right across the landscape. Whereas on the right, up here, you've got these areas that are the favored species, and because they're green, the animals go back there all the time. But you've also got those plants that are not cystivector. This happens under light continuous grazing. What's the energy captured there? Not so good. It might be good here, but it's not so good there. What about here? Not so good. Let's look at the water cycle. Water cycle really good here. Not too bad there because you haven't got any bare ground. But as soon as you haven't got the light continuous, then the amount of bare ground increases. So the amount of water running off and the soil going with it increases. So there's differences in the fundamental areas. In terms of mineral cycling, very good there. They're in for a short period of time. They graze the grass, but not too much. Nutrients go back. The microbes work underneath the soil, and everything works very well. Here you've got underuse and lack of energy being captured, and these plants that are being nubbed off all the time, what do you think their root depth looks like? Greatly impaired because they haven't got a long recovery period, which is here, it's very, very deep. And here you've just got the worst of both worlds. What about plant species composition? Here you've got all the big productive species present because you hit them moderately and you get off and they come back. Here you've actually nubbed off all the desirable species, particularly close to the water, and you've only got a lot of desirable species well away from the water where they're not nubbed off all the time. So you've got an impairment of the species composition there. And here, because you're more heavily grazing, you've A, lost species, and B, they're not in very good health for being productive. Let's make another comparison. Amp grazing on tall grass compared to no grazing. This area here hadn't been grazed for 30 years. There's only 2 species there, big blue stem and little blue stem, fantastic grasses. What do you think is underneath here? Those are big wharfy plants, and there's great gaps in between because they shade over and prevent other species coming through. So the biodiversity is very low. The litter amount is not very high because you haven't got animals in there knocking it down. And the mineral cycling is very, very slow. And the energy capture is, how would you describe it? Very low. So there's not much driving that system at all. The nutrient cycling is not going. The only good thing about that is the water gets in the ground. On the other side here, you've got really good biodiversity, excellent habitat for birds, insects, everything. The dung beetles having a go, the earthworms having a go, and they're dominated by fungi, which are really important in driving the whole system. So this is a picture from Saskatchewan, one of the guys that we're working with, continuous grazing beforehand, and after 10 years of management, moved to Amp Grazing. The soil carbon 1% changed to 10% over 10 years, and infiltration moved from ½ inch an hour to 8 inches an hour. That makes for a huge difference in productivity. And the guy's Neil Dennis, who's one of the best guys I've met anywhere in the world. This is from Australia, showing these are two brothers. They inherited from their father. The guy on the right carried on doing normal fertilizer, planting of wheat and grazing it. The fellow on the left changed to intensive grazing and what they call pasture cropping, without any chemical inputs at all. And you can see how dark it is all the way down, showing carbon. Look how much the carbon increased all the way down over 10 years, compared to the starting off point from his brother's place. And one of the things that most scientists, if you look at the carbon literature, they've been measuring at 20 centimeters, 30 centimeters. So they're missing a huge amount of the total amount of carbon that's actually been fixed. So the depth is something that we've really neglected. Let's now look at the little critters that work for us for free and how important they are. First of all, soil structure is a biological thing. You can't put a chemical on to improve it. So looking after the plants above to look after the microbes below ground is really important. So they improve soil structure. These are a network that really connects across a large area of land and collects all the plants. And it effectively extends the root volume and depth, so the plants have greater access to soil moisture, fertility, etc., than they would have in the absence of them. The plants put out exudates that enable the fungi and bacteria to increase carbon, and mycorrhizal fungi are the prime source of stable soil carbon. They increase water retention and nutrient retention, increase drought resistance, and they fend off pests and pathogens. A lot of work being done on soil microbes at the moment that show the benefits. 80% of the microbes below ground are beneficials. It's the same as the microbes inside human beings. And if you take something that kills off what you consider a pest, it kills off all the beneficials at the same time. So the trick is to manage so that you're looking after the beneficials and then they take care of a lot of business. And we've got a lot of data that shows the highest plant growth occurs when you've got a high fungal to bacterial ratio. So the other little puppies that really work for us well are earthworms. And you can manage in agriculture very quickly, plowing and putting too many inorganics on there that basically get rid of the earthworms completely. If you've got a healthy soil with healthy earthworms in it, they are producing enough nutrients to drive any crop and give you really good productivity at no cost. You just got to look after them and know how to. The other things that are really underestimated are dung beetles. Now, you've got many kinds here. I've put down 3 major ones, the tunnels, the dwellers, and the rollers. And what they do is dig into the soil, and these little pathways that they create not only recycle the nutrients very quickly so that you don't get nutrients lost, but these are pathways for quick water infiltration into the ground, and they improve the amount of water that gets in the ground a lot. And the value that has been very spread in North America has been put at about $2 billion per year. The services provided by the earthworms and the dung beetles. And with high density regenerative grazing, 200 cows drop 25 tons a week and increases infiltration by about that amount. Now, observations that we've made on people that have got where they move every day in their paddocks, that high density of cattle just attracts the dung beetles. They follow the cattle around. So you've got a whole population there that's moving steadily over the whole property and enhancing the positive impacts of things like dung beetles and enhancing the ecosystem services. So if you have a very low density of cows spread all over the place, there's nowhere near the same density of effect that you're getting with all these beneficials. So let's see how that translates in. What we've done is, this is Denton, which is just north of Dallas, and that's about 80 kilometers back upstream. And this is a watershed that they've been managing the output of since the early 1900s. But we actually simulated using ARS watershed model over that period there, and these are the ranches that I worked on. The green is rangeland, the yellow is wheat that's grazed, and the dark green is forest. So basically a grassland ecosystem. And we looked at the quality of water and the outflow. So the red is surface runoff. That is groundwater, i.e. what's getting in the ground and seeping through, very healthy. Heavy continuous grazing, light continuous grazing, amp grazing, and exclosure. And you see much more runoff here. Great improvement here. Much improved here, even greater there. Look at the area that hasn't been grazed. There's very little difference. There's no significant difference between those two. Remember I said earlier, the watershed characteristics of an ungrazed area are going to be very good. What about the other things, the energy capture and the nutrient cycling? They're absent here, whereas there, that's pretty much like a natural situation. That's the value of managing well. So look at the stream flow that comes from that. These are very high because most of it is runoff. And here, although it's less than that, it's still very good. And most of it is actually getting under the soil and slowly delivering the water supply. Nitrogen loads, exactly the same. A great decrease in nitrogen loads with those two treatments, and ditto phosphorus loads. So all around the watershed hydrology results of managing better are greatly improved. Let's now, last year we managed to get some money from Shell, Edmonton up there, Calgary. And these are the properties that we did work on. The Hoven Ranch, the Towers Ranch, the Cross Ranch, and the Holtman Ranch. And we did some across-the-fence comparisons of continuous graze and amp grazing just to see what the situation was. And here's an idea of us taking soil samples on the Towers Ranch at Red Deer. You can see where we took it in the landscape. And here we took the catenal position, the top, the middle, and the bottom, and you see them spread over there. We did some samples here, and then analysed that whole batch together, so we got a spread of what's happening there. We we took soil cores to measure carbon down a meter, and we measured the infiltration using a very good low variance method of measuring the infiltration. On top of that, we did some carbon isotope sampling where we exposed in these cages here, we exposed the plants to labeled CO2 so we could determine the instantaneous sequestration of carbon on the amp grazers and next door across the fence on the continuous grazers. So we said, okay, after they've been managed for 10 years differently, what's the situation happening now at the same time? And we haven't finished these results yet, but the AMP is ahead of the others. And what we're measuring here is some of the GHG output at the same time. So, and these are some of the results from the AMP grazing and the LCG. Soil organic carbon accrual rates were 1.4 on some of the soils, up to 2.5 on some of the other soils. And in every case, the AMP was higher than the continuous graze that we measured against. It was lowest in the sand and highest in the clay loam soils. So here's the infiltration of HCD versus AMP grazing on the, this is the sandy soil and these are the clay loam soils, and you can see there's a huge difference in some of these areas in the infiltration that occurred on those areas. And this is the rooting depth on the towers, which is planted pastures, and you can see the bulk of the roots doesn't go nearly as deep as with the native grasses on the Cross Ranch. And we believe that with good management, you actually increase the amount of carbon to saturation, and then the pool starts increasing lower down just because of the deeper roots that are happening in the perennial pastures. So that's all I got on the grazing, and now we're going to move across to managing cropping land, but using cover crops instead of inorganic fertilizers. The cover crops build up the fertility, and then in a rotation with your crop, you build up the fertility, and then with or without grazing, grazing has been shown to further increase the productivity of it just using an organic form of fertilizers. So the cover crops, you can have warm season cover crops or cool season, or both. And basically they cover the soil, they build organic matter, build aggregates, improve the water cycle, enhance nutrient cycling, enhance fertility, improve seed-to-end ratio, provide crop diversity, enhance pollinators, improve wildlife habitat, and when you increase livestock, I'll show you some figures later on, you increase the productivity and the fertility of the area that you're managing. The Germans, prior to the Second World War, when the fertilizers, the nitrogen fertilizers, inorganics were developed, they had biological systems, and they'd figured out that 17% of the land needs to be under grazing at any one year and rotated around. And you could maintain doing that. You could maintain the fertility. If you needed to build up the fertility in your cropping system, you increased the percentage up to 20 or 25% to build it up. But they had that figured out, and we're finding exactly the same with the producers that we're working with in this country now. So here's an idea at North Dakota. Cover crop with 25 species. We found that the greater the diversity of cover crop, he was using 25 species, and you get much better response and increased carbon and fertility by using the greater diversity with the greater diversity of plants. And that's, they just turned the animals in there. They'll be in there for half a day, and then they moved on with an electric fence further on. So here they're moving to the next one. Now look at the amount they're leaving behind. Is that a problem? Is it wasted? No, it isn't. What we're finding, let me just go back here. What we're finding is that if you leave high quality stuff that you trample onto the top of the ground, that's what feeds your worms in particular, and a lot of the other soil microbes like fungi. And that builds up your soil very, very quickly. In other words, they're using part of the primary productivity to feed the microbes, which actually produces the fertility and the increase in carbon that they're doing. And these are currently our policies that we're testing in the field by working with them. This is from Colin Seiss that work in Australia. And by increasing the amount of carbon using improved cropping and grazing practices, look at the amount of each one of these things has improved. One of the characteristics of current agriculture, since the 50s, the nutrient density of plants has decreased to be about 30 or 40% of what it was back in the 50s. And that's because all we do is we chuck NPK out there and look and select for maximum biomass productivity rather than looking at the nutrient density of the plants. As soon as you switch across to a biologically driven system, then you come back to where you were before. You've now got living soil, living people, and healthier food for the people. Now, this is Gabe Brown's place, where they've done measurements on organic farmers, neighbours in their county. No-till with low diversity of cover crops, no-till a moderate diversity, and a lot of fertilizer inputs, and the no-till with high biodiversity of cover crops with livestock improved, incorporated in a rotation. Now they have had no fertilizer since 2007, and this is the amount of fertility that they've built up. And they're completely biological. There's no synthetic inputs or pesticide inputs. The rotations of the crops break the pesticide cycle, and the way they've looked after putting carbon in the ground has resulted in these levels of fertility. This is the water extractable organic carbon, and you can see how much it's increased relative to other ways of farming. Here's an example of the Rhoda Institute up in the Northeast in America has been working on completely organic means of corn production. This is in a very dry first half of the year in Tennessee. And what they found, as soon as they switch across from conventional to no-till and no-till with cover crops, is in a wet season, these will produce as much as those. In a dry season, The conventional stuff, because the quality of your soil is diminished, produce much less than where you built up the biology and the amount of organic matter in the soil. And this is, people are getting these same results all over the place. So let's just revisit some of that. Here you've got beneficial effects with each of these things. As soon as you've got tillage, you're causing damage to your soil. If you use no-till with low crop diversity, with high crop diversity and cover crops, you get increases in productivity there. And as soon as you bring in livestock into the situation, you jump up the productivity even further because you're bringing more biology in there. The dung beetles and stuff like that just bring something to the table. A lot of research that they're doing in Europe at the moment has come across with exactly the same results. So, keys to healthy soil in an agronomic setting. Cover the soil all the time. Have high plant diversity, minimize mechanical disturbance, grow plants for the maximum days each year. Why do you think that's important? If you've got a green plant out there, it's pulling in energy. If you've only got a certain time of the year when that's happening, you're going to diminish the amount of energy you're putting into your system. If you've got something there all the time that's green, then there's a greater number of days that you're actually pulling into the ground. Now, fungi in particular like to be fed all the time. So the longer period you've got there, the more fungi are going to be part of the equation, and they are very, very beneficial. You need to manage livestock to enhance the soil function. Use organic amendments, reduce N fertilizers in particular. That sets you back quite a bit because that gets rid of your fungi very quickly. And use regenerative grazing. So as part of the Paris Agreement, they've used a model, the Rothschild model from England, to say what the potential is according to the model of how much carbon we can get in the ground. This is a very high potential, and it comes down to fairly low. So you can see very high potential areas here and relatively low areas, the yellow there, that you know about. But these figures are very low compared to what we have measured in our particular study. When we come up here and some of the other studies we've got, the mean of all the northern Great Plains is 2.5 tons carbon over 20 years. East of the Mississippi, where you got longer growing periods, and you've also got good growing conditions, over 5 years, 7 to 8 tons of carbon per hectare per year increase over the previous management. This is the measured stuff that I've published from Texas in the Northern Plains, 3 tons per hectare per year. And as you go drier, you get much less response, half a ton. But the interesting thing is you always get an improvement after your management improves in the amount of water that gets in the ground, the infiltration rate. And you pick it up, and it's much higher here than the amount of carbon would demonstrate. So very early on, you're getting the benefit of getting more carbon in the ground because your improved management is improving the soil and microbial population. But it takes a long time in those dry areas to manifest itself in terms of increased carbon. Now, a lot of people just say, cows, you need to get rid of them because they cause all the problem. This is work that was done up in the Northern Great Plains, light continuous grazing and heavy continuous grazing. They looked at the carbon sinks and emissions. These are the emissions of the cows that they measured, grazing under heavy continuous grazing. And there were fewer cows, so there were fewer emissions. But light continuous grazing still had much more sequestration than the emissions. So this is the data that we had. We did a life cycle analysis of light continuous to AMP, and you can see this is a greater amount being sequestered. If you change from heavy continuous to light continuous, you get a great increase in the amount of sequestration, and your emissions are lower, so your balance there is much better. But if you have heavy continuous to AMP conversion, then you get even more carbon in the ground sequestration, and it offsets the amount of emissions you're getting from the cattle. And colleagues of ours working up in Michigan, they used Amp Grazing with a low input system and a high input system. The one just managing as if it was rangeland, and the other one with both had legumes involved in it. The high input system had a bit of irrigation because they went in a very wet area. And the sequestration in both of those pastures exceeded 3 tons. It's getting on close for 4 tons. So in their Northern Plains study, they got more sequestration than emissions from the cattle. So let's look at the big picture for North America. We had this published last year, and some of the leading carbon people in the world were working with us, Ratan Lal and Jerry Hatfield and people like that. If you look, this is the net GHG emissions, and the green is livestock production. Those are the emissions from it. Farm soil erosion is a large component, and fertilizer and cropping is another. So you've got a positive footprint, carbon footprint, from current, all the figures from published literature. If you reduce the ruminants by 50%, what difference does it make? Very, very little. Now, if you used current cropping and changed to regenerative grazing, if you operated 25% amp grazing, you can see you almost balance out the other two. And if you get greater than 25%, now the amount you're putting in the ground puts you in a negative carbon balance. The next slide shows changing to regenerative grazing as well as regenerative cropping, where you're using cropping practices that have a negative carbon sequestration. No-till cover crops, and you don't put on pesticides or inorganic fertilizers. And you huge benefit from doing that. So this is the basic of research of doing it into the future. So this is our basic hypothesis that if you build up the water components by improving carbon, reduce the soil erosion, increase biodiversity, you increase the food quality, and we believe that it will change in the long term towards improved farm economics. And I think there's a link up with human health that we're working on now. Have any of you read the book, The Hidden Half of Nature? That is a book you've got to read. It shows a connection between soil health and human health, and there's a great deal of very good human microbiome work that's been done. The medical guys know a lot about why we need to eat better and look after our human microbiome. Now I'm going to end by showing you a couple of the shots that we took in our earlier study. This is the Holtman Ranch. That's a view across the pasture, and this is viewing into it. And that's the neighbor who is actually lightly continuously grazed. A, there's a lot more here. And B, you had all the good productive plant species there. Green going all the way down, so you're photosynthesizing all the way down. Very, very good litter cover there. And the insects that occurred in here were all beneficial. It's a huge variety of insects when you walk through it. Across the way here, which is just a fence line between them, all we found here was grasshoppers and lots of them. A very biodiverse, diminished situation. And this, of course, is much more positive. Short graze, long periods of recovery. He had about a 90-period recovery, so only grazed once a year. But his total system productivity was considerably higher than when he started and considerably higher than was occurring here. So he had very good management. This is done at Nanton. John Cross. When you first look at this, you think, well, there's not much difference here, but there actually is. There's more green across the landscape there. When you go in there, when we walked around and we collected different species, we came up with about 30 or 40 different species here that didn't occur in there. So the species diversity was greatly improved. And when you look down into the ground and look at the earthworm activity and the dung, where you saw the cattle, and look for dung beetles, plenty here and almost absent there. So the overall biological health of those two things was very, very different. Now, this is the Holtman Ranch near Tabor, where he's been managing for quite a while, but the trouble is they were in a real drought. So I've got no good pictures to show you. I just took these off the web. But he's done quite a good job of increasing the carbon there in a very testing environment, a much drier environment than the other two ranches. And we thank those people for working with us. And that is all I have, and I would be glad to answer any questions.
Thank you.